I'm the director of Rebuild by Design. Thank you so much for joining us. Great to see so many of you here and interested in Massachusetts. We're going to be talking about the Atlas of Disaster Massachusetts, which is a recent report that we put out a couple of weeks ago. And we're really excited today to have Katherine Antos and Maya Mansfield to join us. So we're going to start off today with Johanna Lawton, who's the deputy director, who's going to give you just a background on what's happening on the ground in Massachusetts. And then I'm going to greet our key speakers for today. So Johanna, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Thank you so much, Amy, and good afternoon, everyone. So just to set the stage for the discussion today, I want to brief you on some of Rebuild by Design's latest research, what builds on a reality that we are all currently seeing. It doesn't take too many scrolls on your phone, too many flips through the newspaper or clicks on a website to find yourselves landing on a headline that indicates the amount of risk that we are all seeing consistently and with more frequency related to extreme weather disasters. And Rebuild by Design's report, The Atlas of Disaster, brings us to a county by county look at these disaster impacts, providing some of the data and that quantification behind these horrific stories that we are seeing so frequently, and helps us better understand the impact at this scale as well as the cost of these events. And what it reveals to us is that whether you are in an urban or rural community, a coastal, riverine, Republican, Democrat, every corner of the country is experiencing a severity of impacts due to major disaster events that are occurring because of extreme weather. And we are seeing this again when you look across the entire country, that it's impacting every corner. And these experiences are not felt equally. 95.5% of US counties have faced at least one federally declared extreme weather disaster since 2011. And actually, 99% of congressional districts have experienced a major disaster event. And so our tool, the Atlas of Accountability, allows you to take a deeper dive into your specific state, your municipality, your county to better understand what that impact looks like by the numbers. And today, I want to talk to you about what that means for Massachusetts. Between 2011 and 2024, Massachusetts experienced 11 federally declared major disasters due to extreme weather, costing taxpayers over $541 million in federal assistance. That's money that's gone to communities after they have already suffered an event to help recover. And every county in Massachusetts has had at least 3 recent major disasters, with 80% of the counties in Massachusetts having had at least 5 federal disasters. Bristol and Suffolk counties in Massachusetts have had the highest number of disasters in the state, with 8 in just the time frame of 2011 to 2024. In our research report, the Atlas of Disaster Massachusetts identifies with these maps where those disaster declarations have occurred. And again, you can see it stretches across every corner of the state. And what we have right here, juxtaposed to each other, is also where all the federal assistance has been obligated for these events. And you can see again that when we combine the FEMA and HUD's post-disaster assistance, those recovery funds that go to communities after they've experienced an event, it tallies up to $541 million in post-disaster recovery. And that's really just a slice of the pie. We're talking about federal assistance. We know the state puts a lot of money into recovery as well as on numerous loan programs and the payouts that insurance and homeowners are putting towards recovery. We get a sense of the magnitude of this cost, but also know that there's a lot more to these events. Our report also details the social vulnerability index across Massachusetts at a zip code level and includes an energy reliability index, which shows you where, on average, it takes the longest for power to come back online after a major outage event. So you can see areas that have the darkest colors, on average, take longer to come back online during a major power outage. Our report also captures a lot of information across and collects information across some of the most recent research on the way that disasters and climate change are impacting the state and how it cuts across the impacts to physical damages, to properties, whether it is a flood event or an extreme snowfall, as we've been seeing a lot of this winter, and the disruptions and surmounting costs to communities because of these events, in addition to the drastic rise in costs that we're seeing to insurance for homeowners, and the rising costs of energy and utility bills. Um, as well as some of the cascading impacts from major events, especially with extreme heat, where we're seeing a rise in hospitalizations and health impacts. Our report shows you exactly how these impacts compound each other, from the physical impact of an extreme weather event to some of those medium and long-term health implications, and what that means for housing stability displacement, as well as respiratory illnesses and mental health impacts. Um, Coupling are in our companion to this report, we have an online digital map where you can actually search your address and find the data for your county as well as your district. So you can put in a specific address, and it will give you information about the number of disasters that your county has had. You can toggle on this map, and you will see the link in the chat to access this map. You can toggle and see your representatives at the state level and the congressional level. We've also included in our report all of the data behind these impacts for 2011 to 2024. So what this means is you can see every single county, the number of disasters that they have experienced in this time frame, the total amount of dollars that FEMA has obligated to that specific county. And you can look at it by specific event. So if you want to understand how a certain event cost the entire state in post-disaster assistance, or if you want to look at a specific county and understand how it's been impacted in terms of frequency of events, as well as the amount of post-disaster assistance it has received, you can access our data tables. And we know that in a time where data is frequently disappearing and becoming harder to access, that this is so critical. We hope researchers and advocates, organizations will use this and build on it. And we are happy to provide anyone who is interested with these spreadsheets. So I don't mean to set the stage with this being all doom and gloom. While these numbers are stark and lay certainly a not so pretty picture for us all, it's also an opportunity. What we really want to discuss today is when we plan ahead, when we invest in communities and build infrastructure that lasts and that reduces risk, we can reimagine a better future for all our communities. And by working together, we can control our outcomes. So with that, I'll make sure that you have the links in the chat to access this data, and we'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Johanna. And before we go further, I also just want to recognize that Aaliyah Kinsley has put a lot of sweat and tears into this report and also to this event. So thank you, Aaliyah. She's in the background that is helping us with the Q&A and do some of the tech. So we really appreciate that. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers. First, we have Katherine Antos, who's the Undersecretary for Decarbonization and Resilience at Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, which might be the longest title of anybody that I've ever introduced. And I wonder if you have any like cool acronyms of like how you refer to yourself, like are you the Undersec DEPCAR or something like that? But thank you for being here. She leads the efforts to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and equip people, environment, and infrastructure to adapt to climate change. Undersecretary Antos previously served as the Deputy Executive Director for Planning and Sustainability at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, where she oversaw planning and initiatives to advance a more resilient Greater Boston region. She received regional and national awards for her previous roles as senior policy advisor and branch chief at Washington, D.C.'s Department of Energy and Environment and at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Chesapeake Bay Program Office. I think it's really clear from all of your experience that you were born to be in this role. And Undersecretary is joined by Maya Mansfield, who is the Assistant Secretary for Resilience at the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And in this role, she leads the adaptation and resilience team that is responsible for implementation of Resilient Mass Plan, which we're going to hear a lot about today, EEA's new Office of Climate Science, and the Municipal Vulnerability Grant Program. So thank you both for being here, and we'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Amy. So it's a pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you, Amy and Joanna, for really setting the stage for today's conversation of what the state is doing to help us scale the implementation of resilience actions. And also thank you to all of you in the audience for joining, for learning about this. You know, I see members who have been partners in this work to date who have helped to advise us, and then also other states who have inspired us in terms of what they're doing. So really appreciate this opportunity to share with you what we're doing in Massachusetts. So what Maya and I are really excited to speak with you about is everything that is happening within Massachusetts to really advance the preparedness of our communities for what they're experiencing now. What we just heard from Joanna's, excellent stage setting for they're experiencing extreme weather, sea level rise, extreme heat, flooding. They're experiencing it now. They're going to continue to do so in the years and decades ahead. And so the good news is we can do something about it. We can help them to prepare for this, and we can help them prepare for it in a way that when those storms happen, there's less damages, there's less loss of life, and also there's benefits for this work along the way. So next slide. And so really what we heard earlier through the Atlas was a great summary of the key climate hazards that we face here in Massachusetts. In terms of threats to our built infrastructure, like our buildings and our transportation infrastructure, the biggest risk is flooding, not just coastal flooding, but also inland flooding. And when it comes to mortality and morbidity, the biggest threat that we see is extreme heat, and not just how high the temperature gets, but also how humidity is increasing, how the minimum temperature in a day is also going up, so you don't get that cooling at night. So we're seeing those effects now, and we're going to see them continue to grow. And so before I get into the specifics of what we're doing about funding and financing and trying to scale this work to prepare our communities, I want to take a moment to set the stage for how do we assess these hazards and these impacts and put together an action plan here in Massachusetts. And really all of this is done within our Resilient Mass Plan, which is our statewide hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan. It includes a look at the climate science to help us understand to what degree these hazards like flooding and extreme heat and wildfires are affecting Massachusetts. And then we do a climate change assessment that says, okay, of each of those hazards, how are they affecting built infrastructure, human health, government, the economy, natural resources, and we rank those impacts based on how big it is, like how much flooding might occur, the disproportionality of the impact. So how much does it affect particularly vulnerable populations like the unhoused, low income, those with underlying health conditions compared to the population at large. And then finally, how big is the adaptation gap? How much more do we need to do to, say, protect from that sea level rise? So based on that, we were able to see, okay, here are the impacts to our infrastructure, our people, our natural resources, our government, our economy that is most important for us to address. And through that, in the Resilient Mass Plan, we work across all secretariats of Massachusetts government to put together an action plan that's done every 5 years. This is all updated every 5 years to remain eligible for FEMA funds for what we are going to do to address those those impacts and to minimize those risks. The last Resilient Mass Plan, it was adopted by Governor Healy in 2023. And one of the big things in there was we really need to support our communities. As we heard earlier from Rebuild by Design colleagues, they are often the front line when a disaster hits, and they are really thinking front of mind about what they can be doing to prepare and protect those communities. And so therefore, some of the major actions within the plan were really looking at funding and at finance and what more we could be doing to help them to scale the pace that they are implementing practices such as resizing culverts so they can handle stronger storm flows, removing dams that are at high risk of overtopping and would create significant damage if they fail during an extreme weather event, nature-based solutions like salt marshes or floodplain restorations that reduce flood risk, and also projects that can reduce exposure to extreme heat. Communities know what they need to do. They want to be able to do more of it. And so a key priority for us in our 5-year plan was to figure out how to help them to do so. Next slide. And so therefore, to act on that action, we in the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and also working closely with our colleagues in the Office of Climate Innovation and Resilience. For those of you that are not from Massachusetts, Massachusetts is actually the first state to have a cabinet level climate chief, Chief Melissa Hoffer. And so we also worked with her team, the Massachusetts Department of Transportation, and our Executive Office of Administration and Finance to put together a resilient mass finance strategy to really help us think through strategies to help us scale the pace of implementation for projects that can keep communities safe. Next slide. And so one of the things that this strategy looked at is what are the needs, but also what are the values of these investments? And we looked at that both nationally and also with data that we had within the state. And the key takeaway is that by and far, the value of these investments far exceeds what the upfront costs are. Looking at it in terms of avoided damages, but also avoided economic disruptions, and also some of the co-benefits that exist in terms of job creation or increased recreational access or ecosystem benefits. And so nationally, FEMA had found that every dollar invested in natural hazard mitigation would avoid $6 over 20 years. The US Chamber of Commerce actually in 2024 looked at the broader definition of not just avoided damages, but also avoided disruptions and the economic benefits. And they found for every dollar invested, there were $13 in avoided damages and benefits. And then within Massachusetts, when we looked at, and so what are those different types of costs that we're reducing because of resilience investments? We found, for example, every dollar invested in a culvert is going to avoid $4 in culvert repairs or road repairs. Removing a dam is 60% cheaper than having to repair and maintain that same dam over 30 years before you even think about and what would be the damages that you're dealing with or the loss of life if that dam were to fail. And then things like salt marsh restoration, there's just so many co-benefits in terms of habitat value, fisheries value, including commercial value of that recreational access that really the benefits of that are much higher. Next slide. So therefore, it's no surprise that we've seen this trend across the state that communities want to do more of this work. In Massachusetts, we have 351 cities and towns. 349 of them have participated in our municipal vulnerability preparedness program, our MVP program, to come up with plans that help them to identify what are the vulnerabilities within their community. Once they do those plans or have those plans stay up to date, they can then apply for action grants that help them to implement the plan. And what this chart is showing is how much the total amount requested through the MVP Action Grant Program has increased in recent years. And it's both in terms of numbers of applications we're seeing, and then also the total amount requested. And I'll also note the geographic diversity. In the early years of this program, it was much more in the Boston area, Eastern Massachusetts. And in the last round, we actually saw the most applications coming from the Connecticut River Valley. We're seeing more than ever coming from the Berkshires. So it really is a statewide need. And in FY26 for the action grants, we got over $110 million requested, and we were able to fund less than 29 million of it. And that ratio of requests coming in and what we're able to put out through our grants is consistent across other resilience grant programs as well. Next slide. So that exactly got to, so we need to come up with a finance strategy to help us put more tools in the toolbox for communities. We can't rely on our grants alone. They're very important, but we can't rely on them alone. And also really stretch every dollar. We went through this project working with a stakeholder advisory committee. It was about 40 members that represented regions of the state, from the Berkshires in the west to Cape Cod in the east, and everywhere in between, local staff, elected officials, regional planning agencies, also nonprofits, the private sector. And they met 5 times over the course of this period to really help us think through what can we be doing to stretch every dollar, what are the additional tools in the toolbox we should be considering. We also did focus groups with communities, met one-on-one with members of industry and also different communities, think through like what are the kind of things that they're trying to get done and how can we help make that happen. And so coming out of that, we ended up with a roadmap that really rested on 4 pillars. One is we need to make projects easier to implement, because if it's easier to do, it will be faster and it will therefore be cheaper. So how can we do that in a state? The second is, of our grant programs that we have, we need to make the best use of it. So how can we streamline them? How can we expand access to that funding to make sure the highest priority resilience needs in communities, we're matching that with the grant dollars that we have. The third one is implement financing mechanisms. So really think about how we can use finance tools like loans to help leverage every public dollar, and also think about how we could pull in private dollars as well. Again, not that the grants are going away, but we need additional tools in the toolbox if we're going to be able to help communities do more of that actual construction and restoration that's going to keep them safe and handle these larger projects that our grants alone can't handle. And then finally, build the regional and organizational capacity. So for those of you who are from outside of Massachusetts, we really do not have a strong county government. So it means our 351 cities and towns, they're going at this on their own, whether their population is 2,000 or 700,000. And so therefore, it means that we really need to think about how can we build their capacity where there's a regionally significant project to work together to identify that need and get that project from identification to planning to design to permitting and then getting that project in the ground. And so with that, I am pleased to turn it over to Assistant Secretary Maya Mansfield. Or actually, no, I realize not quite yet. Maya's going to talk more about the specific things that we are doing now in each of these 4 pillars. But before she gets into that, I also want to talk about some exciting legislation that Governor Healy introduced last summer that is also going to help us to implement these 4 pillars. So next slide. So this slide I don't need to spend much time on because really I think the Atlas of Disaster set the frame well of that. In the past few years, we're seeing a lot more extreme weather and sea level rise, and our communities are feeling it. And I would say this has been especially true in recent years, where we've had the driest year, followed by the wettest year, followed by the driest, rapid onset drought. We're seeing wildfires, we're seeing flooding. It's just a lot happening. We're seeing extreme heat that's causing schools to close. So at the same time we were seeing these impacts, it was also the time for the state to put together an environmental bond bill, which is something that we do every 5 years to authorize the capital spending within my secretariat, the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and the agencies within our secretariat. And so as we were putting together this bond bill, we were looking at how can we do it in a way that supports resilience. And also a bond bill can also include policies too that help to advance these goals. Next slide. So last June, Governor Healy introduced the Mass Ready Act, which is our environmental bond bill. And really, you can see in its name, Mass Ready, an act to build resilience for Massachusetts communities, that it really is focused on resilience. And so each of the things, whether it's the capital funding authorizations or the policies that we put forward, they all fit around three pillars. One, how do we strengthen infrastructure so it can withstand current and future conditions? Two, how can we invest in local economies so that they can handle current and future conditions? And then three, how do we protect water and nature? And now I'm going to turn it over to Assistant Secretary Mansfield to go into more depth about what we're doing now to advance those four pillars of making projects easier, increasing access to funds, introducing finance, and building regional capacity, what we're doing now to advance that work, and then also how Mass Ready, if and when it is passed, would allow us to take it even further. So with that, I'll turn it over to Maya.
Thank you, Catherine. Next slide, please. So as Catherine explained, I'm going to just walk through those four priorities and tell you a little bit about what is going on now to advance them, and then what is coming down the pipeline as Mass Ready sort of moves forward. As Catherine explained at the beginning, these four priorities of the Resilient Mass Finance Strategy are really our framework moving forward for how do we capture these goals of the components of scaling climate resilience action across the state and the areas that we really want to be focused on as a state. So here, in terms of making projects easier to implement, our goal here is really to bring together information around best practices for advancing resiliency across different topic areas, hazard areas, and very clear guidance on how to do it, how others have done it, and key efforts that we'd like to see scaled across the state. Two notable projects are the Climate Resiliency Playbook that our team developed together with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council and funded by the Barr Foundation. So thank you to those important partners to really put together best practices in an interactive sort of online filterable playbook that we are committed to continue to build out over time. The second, incorporating resilience into the design of critical infrastructure projects, is another project that we are kicking off now to really develop more consistent information and guidance and standards as to what does it mean to integrate climate change projections into the design of these projects in the existing design manuals that engineers are working from, so that we can ensure that the projects that are being invested in, reviewed by, supported by the state, and also outside of the state, are being designed with climate change in mind and designed to function and recover across their intended useful life. Mass Ready is going to take these efforts further in a few different ways. One, it introduces some permitting streamlining for nature-based solutions and culvert projects that reduce flooding to ensure that those are moving through the state system faster and more efficiently. And is also looking at the state building code and the board that that determines and updates the state building code, and adding specific expertise in climate risk, resilient design, and housing production, so that we can ensure we have the expertise there to advance these conversations, specifically through the building code, which is such an important lever in ensuring that how we are developing is resilient sort of from the beginning. Next slide, please. The second piece is streamlining and expanding access to funding. And so as Catherine mentioned, we have some very significant grant programs that are funding state, that are funding local resiliency efforts. And our goal is to really bring them together. And it's what we've done through the Environment and Climate One Stop that was launched a couple months ago, to bring together 7 resiliency grant programs into one common application, one front door, inspired by the Community One Stop, which is another program of the state government, so that the burden of determining which application to apply for and to develop multiple applications is removed from the municipalities with one application and put on the state side for us to determine how can we use our resources more effectively, more efficiently, stretch those dollars further, and fund critical projects. And we look forward to the one-stop expanding over time. MassReady takes this further by expanding authorization for funding for a majority of the one-stop grant programs significantly, with significant investments in programs that are addressing inland and coastal flooding and state and local climate readiness. And just to note, before we opened the one-stop applications, we had a round called Expressions of Interest, where applicants submitted project ideas for feedback from state agency and program staff. And we received 535 expressions of interest from over 280 unique applicants and held over 260 individual feedback meetings to discuss over 430 potential projects. So there's a ton of demand, a ton of work going on across the state. And our grant budget is not keeping up with that, but through MassReady, we hope to get a little bit closer. Next slide, please. Implementing financing mechanisms is another critical priority here, because as Katherine explained, our grants are never going to keep up, and we're not going to be able to sort of grant our way through all of these critical project needs. And so it's critical that we're adding more financing tools into our state and local toolbox. And through the MassReady process and through the Resilient Mass Finance Strategy effort, talked significantly with municipalities and other partners about their needs and challenges and priorities, and are putting forward the establishment of a resilience revolving fund that would provide low interest loans to cities, towns, tribal governments, water and wastewater districts in order to fund design and construction of larger scale and regional stormwater management, floodplain protection, and nature-based solution projects. The fund would be managed by EEA, but with the Clean Water Trust administering the actual loans as they do for the other state revolving funds. And that partnership is really critical, showing the success of the SRFs in the clean and drinking water space and bringing that to resiliency as well. Next slide, please. So just a little bit more on the Resilience Revolving Fund proposal. Again, this is within the MassReady Act, so dependent on the passing of that legislation. But as I mentioned, the SRFs, the state revolving funds at the Clean Water Trust, where they manage the clean water and the drinking water revolving funds, have been such nationally successful models, where we saw every dollar of public sector investment and funding yielding $3 in projects. And so the ability to really stretch and recycle funds that are continuously going through the revolving fund. And so shifting and moving from a system of just the one-off grants to looking at more sustainable and long-term financing models that work in partnership with our grant programs and build on them and leverage those initial investments in projects. And really the goal of the fund to be able to provide low interest, flexible loan that can unlock different kinds of projects in communities across the state with specific technical assistance and support for our smaller and under-resourced communities. And as loans are repaid into the fund, the capital is immediately recycled annually into new projects, so that we can continue scaling projects and reinvesting in this work over time. Next, please. And then the last priority here is building regional and organizational capacity. So recognizing that underlying all of these new tools and mechanisms and strategies are the people and the organizations that need to be in place with the capacity, with the time, with the expertise, with the partnerships to actually identify and initiate and do this work over time. So really looking at the state's role in building that regional and organizational capacity. And now there's a few efforts in this space already. As Katherine mentioned, again, we have 351 municipalities operating one-on-one. And so really needing to step into this role of how do we help municipalities to work regionally when they are not necessarily set up to be able to do so. The Resilient Coast Strategy, which is our new plan that was released at the end of last year, which looks coast-wide at the risks that the state is facing and also the near-term adaptation sort of priority areas where we're seeing communities and priority infrastructure where protection is really important and where the flood risk is really significant, and identifying these coastal resiliency districts that, because of the geography and the risk, need to sort of work together on regional solutions and launching new pilots to provide that technical assistance. MVP as well, over the last several years, has expanded its eligibility to regional planning agencies and recognizing their critical role in supporting regions as core partners and trusted partners across the state. And MassReady is really taking these commitments, proposes to take these commitments farther by expanding eligibility further out to nonprofits and community partners that are also critical partners in this work and can work with municipalities and do projects that are supportive of the community's goals. It increases support to municipalities and tribal governments, and where the coast in Massachusetts receives a lot of rightly needed attention. There's also significant, flood risk inland and across rivers on the inland part of the state, and so establishes a new Connecticut River Valley Resiliency Commission to start organizing regional action and prioritization and funding to critical projects along the Connecticut River Valley. And with that, I will turn it back to Katherine to wrap up. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much, Maya. Next slide. And so one other piece in MassReady that does a lot to protect our people and property from flood risk is MassReady includes a provision to require residential flood disclosures. This isn't something that was part of the resilience finance strategy or roadmap, but it's something that's been getting a lot of attention and is being received quite favorably. And so we wanted to share it here. Key things to note is that this would require flood disclosures, so information on past history of flooding, flood risk, future flood risk, what's been done to protect that property. This would be required at the time of sale or at the time of lease execution for both potential buyers or potential renters. And so the idea being that we need to help residents, whether they are owning or renting, because this is one of their biggest expenses, and also it's a way to keep them safe. It's a consumer protection measure. The actual what would need to be included in that disclosure is not spelled out in the MassReady Act. It would be developed between our Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and then also our Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, and we would get input on that. It would be based on readily available information. But this is just a way to ensure that potential renters, buyers have access to consistent information that can help them decide either where do they want to live, or if they want to live in an area that has some flood risk, what they can do to protect themselves, such as making sure that they have the right insurance. Next slide. And so you've heard a lot from both Maya and I about how the MassReady Act, should it be passed, it would allow us to go even further in terms of preparing and protecting our communities and really making these investments that have great value over time. So the Act, as I mentioned, it was filed by the governor last summer. From there, it went through our Environmental and Natural Resources Joint Committee, joint between the Massachusetts Senate and House of Representatives. From there, it also went through the Joint Committee on Bonding, and in both cases, they did not make any changes to what the governor had filed. So now the bill is currently with the Senate Ways and Means Committee. And then from there, it would move on to the House Ways and Means Committee. And then if there are any differences between that Senate or House version, it would go into conference before it would go forward for a final vote and then be on the governor's desk for signature. Our legislative session ends this summer in July. And so we are hopeful that it gets all the way through by then, because again, as I mentioned, it's an environmental bond bill. It includes our capital authorizations, and some of our really important authorizations are running out. And so we need to continue the capital funding, but also there are some really important policies and programs in here too that could help us really stretch every dollar and do more to keep our people, our property, and our natural areas safe and prepared for what they're experiencing and what's to come. So if what you've heard today resonates with you, you can see where that bill is in the process with Senate Ways and Means, and then where it will be going next, House Ways and Means, as it continues to work its way through the process. And we appreciate the support of so many that we've had along the way as we put the bill together, and then as we've been working with the various committees as it moves through that process. And so with that, Maya and I really welcome the opportunity to have a conversation with Rebuild by Design and hear the questions that you have and talk more about what we're doing here in Massachusetts. So thank you.
Thank you both. And thank you for the close to 200 people that have stayed on. Really appreciate it and love this presentation. One thing that struck me about Massachusetts the first time I heard it and so much of your presentation is this idea that Massachusetts does an environmental bond bill every 5 years. You know that we were very involved in the New York State Environmental Bond Bill for resilience, and we're hoping to replicate that success in New Jersey and in other states. And it's just something that's very unique to Massachusetts. So just wanted to, point that out to everybody that's watching, that this is something that Massachusetts should be very, very proud of. There was a recent report that it was Resilient Mass Finance Strategy that talked about the estimate for adaptation being about $90 to $130 billion over the next 25 years. Also something that's very unique to Massachusetts. We haven't seen that in other states, being able to put a dollar amount of what's needed. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to connect that dollar amount to this opportunity of the environmental bond. And maybe you could talk about how you're being able to prioritize those projects.
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Amy. Well, first, the environmental bond bill. I should say when we put it together, we think about what are the 5 years worth of funding authorizations that we need. Unfortunately, we don't necessarily get it done exactly every 5 years. The last one was passed in 2018, which underscores the urgency of what I was saying of we need to get this one passed this session. So when we look at what are the investments that are being made, the number that you mentioned, Amy, from the Resilient Mass Finance Strategy was looking at a rough order of magnitude estimate through 2050. And that's what that 90 to 130 billion represents for about 7 different types of infrastructure, from dams to culverts to nature-based solutions, transportation. And it wasn't assigning, so who needs to cover that? That's all on the state. The state needs to figure that out. It's more saying, no, here are the investment needs of these different types of infrastructure and nature-based solutions. And that could be coming from the federal government, state government, local government, and also the private sector. You heard a lot about the revolving loan fund of that's the first finance tool we're putting in the toolbox and really be stretching public dollars. But we're also going to be looking really hard of what are additional ways that we could leverage private dollars as well, or support the private sector in doing this. That's also an area we want to continue to grow. So I just want to note that people shouldn't be looking at it as an apples to apples comparison of a $3 billion environmental bond bill to 90 to 130 thing. It's 2 different things, but there are key pieces where Mass Ready will help us do more to meet those needs. The MVP program that we talked a lot about, Mass Ready more than doubles it. The Coastal Zone Management Program would get $200 million in funding to support the implementation of that Resilient Coast Plan. There's about 90 million in authorizations for different kinds of other within energy and environmental affairs, some projects that would reduce inland and coastal flooding. And then beyond that, there's also resources that would support removing dams and seawalls and doing restoration. And so there are many authorizations in there that would support that, and also the ongoing development of the Resilient Mass Plan. And another piece too that I just want to note is also what Maya was talking about with the building codes, the resilience standards. That also means that any investment that the state would be making could be doing it with resilience in mind, so that we aren't relying specifically on resilience dollars to do this work. It's no, as you build something, let's make sure we're not building a stranded asset. It's going to be able to last for the duration and it won't be blown out by a flood.
Absolutely. We are huge advocates for that. And yeah, thank you for making that really clear. You know, it's interesting. We're in this not so new, but new moment where the federal government is really changing their priorities. And wondering if you have any advice to other states that are thinking about how to shift all of these different types of capital from local capital, private capital, state capital. Like, what are the things that you're seeing that works that other people can learn from?
Yeah, I'm going to turn that one to Maya.
Jump on that. It's a great point, and I think on one hand, while so much is shifting, we hope that it's not always going to stay like this and that things will come back around. And so, what do we need to be doing in these years to be ready for that and to be even further positioning our larger scale and sort of regional projects and critical infrastructures to be ready for higher amounts of funding in the future? Because so many of those need to go through so many different kind of planning and design phases to actually be ready for those larger amounts of funding. But that being said, I think one thing that's been important for us is to, look at these financing mechanisms like the revolving loan fund that we can stand up on our own, and that can be, independent of what's going on elsewhere, and that, the state can figure out how to grow and stand up and expand. And then in the future, potentially that could be another tool to help leverage state and federal funds by providing match funding for larger federal grants, for example. I think we're thinking a lot about this space around standards and guidance and really making sure that, as what Katherine just said, it's not just the resilience dollars and the resilience projects, but all of the investments that are being made through public sector capital planning processes have the information that they need to be able to consider future precipitation, heat, sea level projections. And so all of these investments are sort of working to reduce risk in the ways that they can. And then the other piece is really thinking about the local capacity side. And that's sort of, we're trying to keep that as, one of our North Stars around what is the support that's needed on the local level in terms of staffing and technical assistance and support with match and supporting with streamlining to make this work easier. It's not that it's all sort of new work, but elements of it are new. And it also making the connections and the partnerships between all of the different sort of agencies and sectors that touch relevant parts of this issue.
Thank you. I just want to remind everyone to put their questions in the Q&A, and we'll move to audience questions in about a minute or two. But I'm kind of curious. My background's in political organizing. I was a community organizer right out of college, and I know you did extensive community outreach. I'm curious what you learned or what surprised you from that process.
Yeah, some of what we learned through that work was just the types of projects that communities wanted to get done and what were some of the barriers that they were facing. And so, for example, I remember talking to a community out in the Berkshires, which is where we have for the most part, very small towns in a very hilly, mountainous area. And they were just talking about they had many culverts that in these stronger storms we were getting were being blown out. And it was more than they could apply for any single grant program to get it done. And they were really interested in taking out a loan, even though they had a very small municipal budget. But they were like, hey, just last week we had a storm and like 3 of our roads were impassable, like our school buses couldn't get through. We need to be able to do this. And here are ways that you could think about how it could be structured to help a community like them, as well as some of our more urban areas, be able to take advantage of this resource. I felt like another thing that we heard a lot was making sure that communities had support on the way so that they would be able to apply for these loans. So for example, some of our smaller communities, they might have a part-time finance director that works like 12 hours a week. And so how can we make sure that they know they are able to do what you need to do in order to be able to access that loan and have organizations that can help them in that work? And I felt like there was just a broad recognition of like, this is another tool in the toolbox. And there was a lot of interest in terms of how could something like bundling grants and the loans and having those things together be a way to achieve some of that, like say principal forgiveness, and then you have to finance the rest. And so, it's just really struck with the commitment and the desire for a whole range of reasons to get these projects done, and just the honest conversations about what these communities would need in order to be able to turn these ideas into reality.
Great. One more question, then we'll go to the audience. I'm seeing across New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, everywhere, people are talking about affordability. Insurance prices are going up. Everything's going up. Obviously, consumer prices are going up. And we're also seeing a lot of people getting cut on insurance. And curious how that's playing out on the ground in Massachusetts. And is there a role for the state in this discussion about how we can lower costs for consumers and also give people access to insurance or continue to have access to insurance?
Yeah, so this is an area where throughout the development of Mass Ready and also throughout the Resilient Mass Finance Strategy work, we had a lot of really important conversations with the insurance industry and heard what's important to them as they're thinking about how do they manage the risk, and they're very interested in what the state could do to reduce that risk. And so one thing I want to touch on is where Maya was talking about work with the building code. This was actually one of their top priorities. They were just like, hey, if you do certain things when that construction or major renovation is going to happen, then that is really going to then have to reduce insurance payments going out. And that's the kind of thing that really help them think about how can they help to manage costs and how can we make sure that Massachusetts stays insurable. So we are lucky that unlike some other parts of the country, we are still a place where our properties are insurable. We aren't seeing that same loss, but we were very cognizant of how we could go about this work in a way that we wouldn't be doing anything that would exacerbate, say, higher insurance rates or dropped policies. So one idea at one point is, well, would a way to fund this be, putting an additional surcharge or fee on property insurance because there's a direct nexus? But actually we heard no, because we don't want to lose that kind of insurance. We don't want to exacerbate costs there. And so the insurance industry was really helpful in saying, actually, there are other ways that the state can gather revenue from different types of insurance, different lines of insurance, and it would make more sense to have the option to use those revenue lines on something called surplus insurance, which is like emerging risks, hard to insure things. That would be the type of thing that would make a lot more sense. It could provide a valuable revenue source, and the industry could get more behind it, and it wouldn't have those same unintended consequences of causing costs to go up for property owners.
And is the state pursuing that?
So actually part of the Mass Ready Act for the Resilience Revolving Fund is it includes the authority for the Secretary of Administration and Finance to take some of that revenue that the state currently gathers. It would not be a new tax. It would not be a new surcharge. It would take some of that existing revenue and put it towards the Resilience Revolving Loan Fund. And so there's the option to do it. Really looking at the balance between what are the needs of the general fund, what are the needs related to resilience. And so that was an idea that we got from the insurance industry that we were able to incorporate into the bill.
So one of the questions we got, which is actually, oh, sorry, Maya, go ahead.
I was just going to add one more point on the insurance space, is that we're also sort of aware of and focused on the very low numbers of residents that have flood insurance in Massachusetts. I want to say that's like 2%, or it's very low. And so looking at support for communities to participate in the community rating systems program to bring down some of those flood insurance costs, and how the state can have a role in sort of providing that technical assistance. It kind of comes back to your previous questions on municipal capacity, but like just giving that staff on the ground capacity to enroll and manage these processes that are just cumbersome but important. And where the state can sort of step in to provide those regional capacity fillers to help multiple communities with similar challenges.
The community rating system is a FEMA program that if a community takes community-wide actions that could end up being like something like building codes, they don't have to necessarily cost dollars or investments in infrastructure, FEMA will actually lower the flood insurance rates for that entire community. So it's a really popular program and something that we love talking about because it like puts dollars back into the pockets of people who are living in the flood zone. On the Resilient Loan Fund, we got a question from the Chief Resilience Officer of New York, actually, asking how you capitalized it, like what was the investment? And you had one example. I'm just curious, are there other investments that you're setting aside for that?
Yeah, and so a way that we could initially capitalize that fund would be using another funding source. Again, no increased taxes, no increased surcharges, but some existing resources the state has to capitalize that fund to get it going for a couple rounds. And then should we need additional revenue going in, then we have the option to use revenue from one of the existing lines of insurance that the state currently collects on.
Is it anything specific or is it just general funding that's going in?
It's not general funding. It's not capital funding. It's actually one of the trusts that we have within the state, and so we can use it for this type of thing. And so that's how we would initially get this revolving loan fund up and running.
We have an interesting question talking about it's kind of like the misaligned incentives. So there's a lot of benefits that could potentially come to the state for investments in infrastructure, but there's also really a need for localities to act. Are there any incentives, or what would you say to a locality of why they need to prioritize this?
Yeah, I would say, and I want Maya to chime in on this one as well, that actually I feel like within Massachusetts through the MVP program, the fact that 99% of them are participating in this program, there's a desire to figure this out and a desire to act. And the fact that it's not top down, like you have to do X, Y, and Z. It's more like, okay, here's information on what climate hazards are, but what are the vulnerabilities within your community? I would say generally, when you think about financing resilience, while the value of these investments is so high, it is like, it can be trickier in terms of, well, when will that storm hit, or who will experience the damages and therefore, be on hand for having to pay for it. And so I think that's why when we're thinking about finance, we need to be thinking about what are solutions at the state scale, what are solutions at the local scale, what are solutions that would allow communities to access those state financing tools, and then also what are solutions that apply more to the private sector as well, so that it's a whole range of tools in the toolbox.
Yeah, and I guess I would add that I think many municipalities across the state and region sort of do see this sort of need and urgency and have significant projects that they are sort of ready to move on. I think from the state side, we're looking at what are the kind of incentives and support that we can build into our programs to make this process a little bit, easier, more streamlined. And that's looking at things like reducing match or providing technical assistance to support with applications, or when we look at the loan fund, looking at the lower interest or other flexible arrangements. And so what is that support that we can what further streamlining can we build in to lower the project costs in other ways, and also provide the support for capacity to participate.
There's a question here that actually talks about that, and some of the suggestions they're asking is like, could it potentially be like help with coastal engineering or contracting with localities so they can save money because it's very expensive. We're at time, but one question we get up in the morning and it feels so doom and gloom, even with like the gray skies, and I know it's going to get nicer, but it's been a hard winter. Just like, what keeps you motivated? What do you have hope for?
I love that question. I would say just having so many great partners in this work, communities that are committed to it, having a colleague like Maya who has really set a lot of the vision for Massachusetts work in resilience and pushing the envelope on what we can do. And then so many of who we see represented on this call are partners that we've worked with in different ways or have really provided us advice. So it just reminds you, like, we're not in this alone. There's a lot of really good strategies out there, and it's just an honor to be, able to put those pieces together in a way that you feel like you can move the ball forward. I'll turn it over to Maya.
Yeah, I totally agree with all of that. And here it's blue skies. It turned to spring just a couple hours ago, so we're feeling better already. But I mean, I think it's yeah, there's such a good team here. We have such strong leadership in the governor and the secretary and the climate chief. And there's so many, smart, dedicated people who are really focused on keeping Massachusetts, strong and resilient and thriving. And so it is an honor to be a part of that. And so many of these solutions, they're complicated and expensive and take a long time and all of that, but there are solutions out there. And it's just a matter of sort of getting there, but we will.
And I mean, I'll tell you what motivates Rebuild is like, we really believe it's an opportunity. Like, when else do you have a chance to rethink your community for the future? It's like, we can take it as a gift, even with all the doom and gloom that comes along with it. But if we act together, then we can alleviate a lot of suffering, and loss of lives and livelihoods. So thank you. We're very inspired by your work. We're inspired by all the questions. I want to make sure that you'll see all the questions. We'll download them for you because we didn't get to all of them, but you can see what people are asking about. So thank you again, and thanks for being our partner. Thanks
Thank you so
everyone
much
for
for having
coming.
us.
Thank you.